Let me first ask you if you have an idea as to what a strong argument is. Any opinions on that? Would anybody like to just throw in some suggestions as to what you think and feel is a strong argument? Anyone?
Acknowledging what the other teams say and providing your thoughts and opinion as to why your point of view is more relevant to the topic at hand.
Okay, relevance. Yeah, that's certainly an important point. Anyone else?
Compelling, convincing.
Say again, Jean-Michel.
Compelling and convincing.
That is compelling in one way or another. Yes, that's a good
convincing.
point.
Having evidence and/or proof for your argument, something to back it up.
Backing, yeah.
Logically consistent.
Consistency, yeah. Great. I mean, all of those points I think are really excellent and definitely all true. So, I mean, what Jean-Michel sort of basically said that on this very basic fundamental level, a strong argument is obviously one that will convince someone of something, right? But just saying that isn't so helpful in terms of, well, how do we create an argument that is like that? How do we make sure that our argument is convincing to the other person, to the person that we need to convince? So perhaps it's useful first to just start with a question of what is an argument. To, before we can know what is a strong argument, it's good to know what is an argument. Now, in a book called A Rule Book for Arguments by Anthony Weston, one that is, by the way, recommended by Paul Carroll as a good introduction to debating, he says that it is to offer a set of reasons or evidence in support of a conclusion. Arguments are efforts to support certain views with reasons. Not all views are equal. Some conclusions can be supported by good reasons. Others have much weaker support. So arguments are efforts to support certain views with reasons. So that's the key thing. You can have an assertion. You can say, I think, politicians are stupid. Okay, fine. That may be a feeling. It may be something you can assert, but unless you have evidence and backing and reasons, then it's not really an argument, and it's certainly not a very convincing argument in and of itself. So let's take an example. For example, if you wanted to be paid more than you currently are, and you've discovered that your colleague who is doing the same job as you, and you're doing just as well as she is, you think that you should be paid the same, right? So you put this to HR or to your boss, and the question back is, well, why? Why should you be paid the same? Because this, at this point, is just an assertion. I should be paid the same. Why? Why should you be paid the same? If your boss can get away with not paying the same and you doing just as well as the other ones, what reason has he got to pay you more? So the first thing for an argument, then, for you to present an argument, and in debating, by the way, when we talk about argument in everyday language, we tend to say, I have 3 arguments in favor of such and such. In debating, we say that the whole package you put forward is an argument. And then within that argument, you have several reasons, grounds, premises that you present as backing for that argument or that claim. So the first reason you may put forward is that people who contribute similar value to the company deserve similar report. We should be paid similarly. Now that may be true. However, is that relevant to your employer? If your employer can get away with paying you less and you producing just as much as the other people, then why shouldn't he continue to do so? So we need something more. We need something that's relevant to the employer. Okay, so then if you can show the league tables, if you can show, look, I'm producing the same as everybody else. I'm doing as well as my better paid colleague. Well, at least this may be an information that's relevant to the employer. The first piece of information is a general philosophical point, but it's not really very relevant specifically to the employer. The second point is more relevant for your employer. It's something that he might look at and go, yeah, okay, I recognize this is relevant. However, at this point, we still haven't given that compelling reason. We haven't given what in debating is called the warrant, because at this point, your employer might say, so you are paid this much, I'm paying John that much, and you're producing just as much as John. So you know what? I'm going to reduce John's pay. That way you're equal, right? Now you'll be equally badly paid because you're both producing the same. So why pay you more if I can just pay him less? So we need the third element, which is it must be important to your employer as well. So if you have a job where you can be replaced with anyone from the streets with the 15-minute training, this is not a strong argument. But if your job is one that takes skills, that you have to, they have to spend money recruiting and training and getting people into the role, getting to know clients, all that sort of stuff. So it would be very, very, very expensive and a big pain in the backside for the employer to actually find someone else. Then this is a very, very important point for the employer. And that is, if you don't pay me more, I'm going to lose interest in this job, and I'm going to go to someone else who will pay me more. And this argument also, or this reason, I should say, sticking to the terminology, is also a good reason why they can't just reduce the other guy's pay, because then he might leave as well, and then they have two gaps to fill. So this is what provides the final warrant in the argument that, okay, yes, we have to increase your salary because otherwise we might lose you, and that would be more expensive to the company and more inconvenient for the company. So a strong argument then must be true, yes. It must also be relevant, as was mentioned, but also it must be important, and not only important to a random person. It must be so you must have reasons that are true, relevant, and important to the audience that you are seeking to convince. Okay, so you may have an audience in the room, some of whom you are simply never going to convince anyway, because they believe so strongly what they're believing. So you're aiming for those people that you can convince, that you can perhaps move to your side. So what you want to think about is that section of the audience. What do they need to hear? And so you fashion your arguments. You make sure they are true, so they can't be questioned for truth value. They can't be thrown out for lack of evidence. They are relevant, so people feel that, yeah, this really goes to the key issue, but also they are important. This is so important, I must vote in favor of this. It's often useful to ask yourself, well, so what? If all of this is true, then, well, so what? What does this compel me to vote in favor of this motion, whatever it might be? Now, something that's specific for the proposition side, because what I've said so far can be true for both sides of the argument, and Andy obviously will talk a little bit more about the opposition side in a moment. But what's specific about the proposition side is that the proposition, so that's the side that is defending the motion, defending the claim that's being put forward in the debate, is that side has the burden of proof. It is on them to prove it. So if, for example, the proposition claims that the Eiffel Tower is 1,500 feet tall, and I just put feet in order to confuse our French members here, because they probably know how high it is in meters, you see. So I just put feet. And so the opposition then, trying to oppose this, says, is that really so? I don't think that's correct. So here he's attacking the truth value. Is it true? And then the what did I do now? I went in the wrong direction. Sorry about that. And then the proposition simply says, well, can you prove that it is not true? And then the proposition says, well, actually, no, I can't. I haven't measured it lately, you know. But that's not how it's supposed to work. The opposition do not need to disprove the proposition's claim. They just need to question whether it has been proven well enough. So in this case, the proposition cannot say, well, there you go, then it's obviously 1,500 feet tall because you could not disprove it. No, that's not how it works. In fact, it is 1,083 feet, which I checked on the Eiffel Tower's website. So I hope that's a source we can trust. So the proposition has the burden of proof. Now, because it has the burden of proof, it also gets to what we say, define the motion. And that's basically to define or to decide what exactly are we going to debate based on this particular motion. Now, we tend to say that we have three types of motions. It's a policy debate, which is that something must change. what we are doing now must stop being done and we must do it in a different way. Then we have a values motion. So that's where we focus in on some sort of moral value. So policy motion last week in 104, we did, this House would introduce digital ID cards. Okay, so that's a change in policy. It's a new thing that we're introducing. So that's a policy, straight up policy motion. Then next week on the 25th, and I recommend everybody who is close enough to or in London to come to that meeting. That's going to be really interesting. It's going to be about whether an action is moral if the intentions are good or if the outcomes are good. Which of those two are more important to decide whether something is truly moral? So that's a very philosophical issue, of course, and that's a motion that focuses on that value question. In the online club, we've also done liberty is more important than security. So that, again, we're debating the values. Third main category is what we call a fact claim motion. So that's like the previous example, the Eiffel Tower is 1,500 feet. So you're claiming something to be a fact. I mean, we've done in the past, the British Empire was on balance either a good thing or a bad thing. I can't now remember which of the two, but anyway, whichever side you make the claim for, that's a factual, you're claiming that as being true, and then you have to defend that. So those are the main three. There are other categories and subcategories, but these three I find are quite a sort of a useful rule of thumb to know what type of debate we're having, as it were. So the proposition must define the motion. Okay, how do you do that? Well, let's say, for example, I just randomly chose this. I'm not sure how that entered into my mind this particular week, but let's say this comes up in a debate. How do you define the motion? How do you decide what are we going to argue for here? Because it might seem obvious, but actually there are two questions to ask. So one is what must this definitely mean? So that is what can't I get away from arguing here? So we must at least argue that the current license fee, the way that it is now, the BBC license fee as it now stands, because this is a policy debate, right? We are changing something that is being done now and we want to do it differently. So the current system should be abolished, done away with. We must at least argue that. If we don't do that, then the other side can accuse us of not addressing the motion. And so that's something we have to do. We have to address the motion. We can't just change it. We can't change the motion, but we can interpret it. So that's where the second question comes in. What can it mean? Okay, so it can, of course, mean that we're just going to do away with all money for public service broadcasting. No more money from, tomorrow. That's it. You have to go out and get your own money out there in the marketplace. No more money at all. That's a perfectly legitimate interpretation, obviously. But it is also possible to interpret it to say that we want to do away with the current financing model and we want a different financing model. For example, the way they do it now in Scandinavia, which is to incorporate it into income tax. So lower income people pay a smaller addition to their income tax for public service broadcasting, and higher earners pay a higher proportion of their, or a higher sort of public service broadcasting sub fee, not sub fee, what's the, anyway, an addition to your tax, basically. So that can be a way to interpret the motion, which is also perfectly legitimate. And that's what can it mean? Okay, so it's very important to have both of those questions in mind when you start to discuss how are we going to define this motion, how are we going to defend it, what exactly do we want to say? And it is a good idea to narrow it down always, because you want to lighten that burden, right? You have the burden of proof. So you don't want to take on more than you have to prove, right? If you start saying, well, we want to do away with the BBC license fee because the BBC is just the mouthpiece of the elites, the powerful elites who are trying to indoctrinate us with communist propaganda, and you go down that whole route and make that your case. Now you're increasing your burden massively. You're taking on all of this stuff that you don't need to prove, because all you need to prove is this financing is not a good idea, and perhaps there are better ways of doing it. That's all. And focus in on that and make it narrow. Don't start taking on stuff that you don't need to prove. So narrow it down. And then there's a concept in debate theory called stasis. You don't need to remember that word, but I thought I'd include it. It's originally from Greek, related to the English word static. So it means the standing still before you start diverging. So it's the point at which both sides can agree. And it's really good, actually, when you're on the proposition side, to just make it clear. I am not tonight arguing for, say, abolishing the BBC, for example, in this case. We just want to finance public service broadcasting in a better and different way. And here is the way we're now going to do it. This is also something, and Andrew will no doubt talk about this, that the opposition can also say that, well, we agree with the proposition that, say, there is a problem, but their solution is rubbish, and we have a better solution if you want to put forward an alternative scheme, and Andy will say more about that. So the stasis is sort of, what are we not going to disagree about? And that's really useful to make clear, just to, again, narrow down and make it clear to people. Sometimes people will make assumptions about what you're arguing, you know, and it's actually quite good to just clarify that and get rid of that assumption. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty of how we actually then structure an argument. And you can do worse than using the model produced by the British logician Stephen Toulmin. So he created the model that has taken his name, and it's quite a famous one. The claim, it has these 6 components. So claim is any claim you make, and it can also stand for the main motion of the debate. It's the burden is on you if you make a claim to say why that's true. So this is where the grounds come in, as he calls it. We sometimes call it the premises, basically the reasons. And now, once you've provided the reasons, let's say you say that we should have more trees in urban areas, and we should plant trees, lots of trees. Okay, so why? Well, because it will make people's quality of life better, and it will improve air quality. So that's 2 grounds. Okay. What's that based on? Have you got the backing for that? Okay. Oh, yeah. So there was a study done, Cambridge, and now you can't just say, oh, yeah, there are some studies that support that. Well, what studies? Well, by whom? You know, we need to know. It's not enough if the tree-loving club, did it in their spare time. Was it Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard? Can you quote some expert opinion? Find the studies, find the facts that can actually support it, and make it clear who these experts are and why we should listen to them, so that the audience can believe it and find it credible. So that's the backing. Now, once you have the backing, remember what I said earlier about the warrant. You know, like if the employer can pay the other people less, you know, then he would. So what's the warrant here? Well, if, for example, it turns out that planting these trees will cost, 10 billion pounds or something, then everybody may agree that that's all true and that's wonderful, but that's just too much. It doesn't warrant that level of expenditure. But if you can find that actually it's just going to cost 5 million or some reasonable amount of money, then there's a good reason to do it. It'll have all these benefits, and it won't actually cost that much. And that's where you have these 2 elements, the qualifier and the rebuttal. So what he calls the rebuttal. So basically, it's the answer to the question, or the completion of this sentence, but not if. So, but not if it's going to cost 500 trillion pounds, right? Then it goes out the window. And then the degree of certainty is to do with, well, are we sure that these studies are relevant for this particular city that we're talking about? If the study was all done in another part of the world, perhaps it doesn't work with us because of these circumstances, whatever. So there's always a degree of uncertainty. So how certain can we be? And these things are important to talk about when you are preparing your argument, so that you can be certain and you can know how much to push those particular points. But also, I think sometimes it can be useful to mention it when you're talking. You say that, look, these studies have been made, and of course we can't be 100% sure, but the likelihood, etc., because that will make you sound more reasonable. And sometimes when people feel that a speaker is being reasonable and being honest about, there's a degree of uncertainty, but if you agree with me that these experts know what they're talking about, then I think, then they are more likely to I think anyway, to agree with you. We will do another workshop on the elements of rhetoric, because in rhetorical theory there's something called the ethos, and that's the degree of credibility you have with the audience, and the reasonableness of your message, and that's a key part also of how you come across in a convincing manner. So let's do a practical example with this before I hand over to Andy. So let's say that the motion is this family would go to the Italian restaurant rather than the French restaurant. Sorry, Antoinette and Jean-Michel, to have our dinner. That's the claim, and we need to defend it. Okay, so why? Why should we go to the Italian? Well, there are two grounds or reasons. One, it's cheaper than the French, and secondly, the food is good. It's great. You know, it's nice. It's just as nice as the French one. We like it equally, and so therefore, because it's cheaper, we should go to the Italian. What's the backing for that? Well, you've checked on the website, so you've seen the facts. The price lists are there, and also we went to the Italian 2 months ago, and you know we know that we like the food. Now, what's the degree of certainty about that? Well, first of all, have they updated the website? Well, hopefully they have, so we can be fairly certain about that. But 2 months ago, what if the chef has left? Perhaps they brought in some other guy and he's rubbish. Well, if they want to maintain their brand, they will have brought in someone with equal skills. So I think we can be fairly sure that if it was good 2 months ago, it's probably good now as well. So we have a good degree of certainty about that one. And then, but not if. But not if, well, let's say the French restaurant has 50% off this week or some voucher or something like that. Well, in that case, obviously, the thing about the price goes out the window. And what's the warrant then? Well, the warrant here certainly must be that if the family is trying to keep to the budget, so that keeping within that budget, and that means the price level becomes very important, and it will compel the family members, at least those who are responsible, to vote for the cheaper alternative if that is equally good. Okay, because so that is what compels them to vote for that. But again, if they have those vouchers, then that warrant goes out the window. Or if they win the lottery before that same day, you know, then hurrah, they can go to the French restaurant. So there we go. So that's just a basic example of how you can structure your argument and think through all the various points that you need to have in order to make sure that your argument is a strong one. So let me then summarize the main points and try and bring that all together. So an argument is a claim with reasons. So not just an assertion, not just some statement of prejudice that you may share with your friends down the pub, but that's not a serious argument that is admissible in a debate. You must have reasons, but those reasons must be true, otherwise the other side can shoot it down. And I mean, when I say true, I mean you must be able to demonstrate that it is true. Okay, I mean you can say that something that is true. But if the other side can say that, well, they didn't prove that, so how can you trust that it's true? And the stranger your claim is, the more important it is to provide evidence. And that's why you want to, for most of the time, to try and stick to claims that most people instinctively feel are true, because then you don't have to work so hard proving it. But if you suddenly come up with something that's quite out of, sort of a bit out there, then you need to work much harder to prove it. So that's something to think about in a debate. Don't start coming out with outrageous claims unless you have some really, really powerful, convincing backing for that. It must be relevant to the issue. So I'll bring an example from a debate we did a little while back. The proposition argued that this house should regret the purchase that what's his name, Musk, purchased Twitter, right? That we should regret it. And then one of the arguments they put forward, or grounds for that, was to say that, well, because the value of the shares have gone down and they have fewer advertisers or whatever. And then the opposition said that, well, how many in this room have got shares in Twitter? So, and nobody had any shares. And so then they said, well, therefore, it's not really relevant and also not really important to the people in the room. So that was a way to undermine that particular argument. They brought many other arguments that were, I think, better and stronger, by the way. But that was one ground for supporting that motion that could be undermined simply by pointing out that actually that's not really very important to us in this room who are voting, and that's why you need to also add to the people you want to persuade. So if it's a motion, for example, that is going to be difficult for left-wing people to swallow, you need to concentrate on them and you need to bring them and show them why, if you're a left-winger, this is what you should support. Or if it's something that's difficult for right-wingers to support, again, tell them this is why. If you're a good, conservative or whatever, then this is what you should, not obviously as blatant as that, but in your mind, that's what you need to think about. How can I get those people over on my side whom I need to convince about this? As I said, the proposition has the burden of proof, so don't start claiming more than you need to. All right, just focus on the motion, define the motion with the following points. First of all, decide as a team when you're planning together, what are you not going to argue for? What are you absolutely not going to be making the case for? And make that explicit to the audience. Just tell them, hey, tonight we're not going to argue for the abolition of the BBC, for example, in that case, but we are going to argue for, and then focus on that. Oops, sorry, damnation, I pressed the wrong button there. This is what happens when you try and make it fancy. Burden of proof, define the motion, right here, and stasis, yes, and then the two questions, what must it mean and what can it mean? And make sure you narrow it down as much as you can, because you don't want the opposition to have a target this size. You want the opposition to have a target that size, much more difficult to hit. So there we go. That was the proposition side of what a strong argument is. So I am now going to stop sharing my screen and hand you over to someone who is a former teacher. So pay attention at the back. Andrew, are you ready?
I am ready, William. Thank you. If I just find my screen to share. And
could I ask a quick question, please, while Andrew's doing that? William, will we get copies of your slides? Or anyone's slides? Or
yes, I will try and produce that.
Okay, all right, thank you.
No worries.
okay, hopefully then we can see my screen. And
yeah, seeing it.
Okay, great. So building an opposition argument then. So we now know what a strong argument consists of. A claim with reasons that are true, relevant, and important, as William outlined. And we know that the proposition has the task of defining the motion and that they have the burden of proof. So then what's the role of the opposition then? To dismantle the proposition's case, to present stronger alternatives, or to convince the audience that there is no problem at all, depending on what the motion is. But to essentially demonstrate that the world without the motion is better than the world with it. There does still need to be this stasis, a common ground, if we like, or what we agree on, what is not being debated. Because otherwise, both sides can just end up talking at cross purposes and no meaningful debate is advanced. So it's relevant for the opposition as well to consider what is being debated, what is not being debated, where's common ground, what can we agree on, so that we actually end up having a fruitful debate, and then we debate what we do disagree on. We're going to look now at an approach which can really help the opposition pick at some potential flaws in the proposition's arguments in order to then build strong opposition arguments. And that approach is called Petal. And it was developed, I believe, by Sean Dolan of the Debate London Club, with whom a couple of us have collaborated in the past. Now, far from having anything to do with flowers, it is, in fact, an acronym. So we have P. Is it practical? E. Is it ethical? T. Has it been tried before? A. Are there any alternatives? And L. Is it logical? Now let's look at each one of these in more detail and apply them to some examples. So we have the practical. If we take the example motion of this house would ration meat consumption, the opposition could first consider how rationing might work in practice. Some hypothetical questions. How much meat per family? What about vegetarians? What about the black market? And who would police that? Would people be able to trade their rations, etc., etc.? By raising lots of questions about the practicality of the proposal itself, the opposition can make the audience question whether it can actually be done at all. Ethical. Now here you would look at how the policy change, in this case, William outlined different types of motions. So if we consider a policy-based motion, how this might go against the values of the audience. Rationing is authoritarian because it goes against personal liberty. It would encourage illegal trading. You could also look at how a given policy might affect vulnerable groups in society, or have other potential consequences that would seem to go against our sense of right and wrong or fair play. By successfully attacking the values that the proposition case is based on, it's a very powerful strategy because most of the time people do vote with their values. Even though something may seem impractical, expensive, or unrealistic, if they agree it's the right thing to do, they'll often vote for it nevertheless. Tried before. So this is where you might look to other countries or points in time to see if something like this has ever been attempted. Rationing was done, of course, during and after World War II, and some other countries have attempted rationing schemes of certain produce since then. But if no other comparable country has done a similar thing recently, that is also something you can use. For instance, there's a reason only communist countries have done this since the post-war period. Or if a policy has been tried before and it's not worked out, then that's also very helpful for the opposition because it's failed. And so then, given that the burden of proof, of course, it lies with the proposition, that then makes it more difficult for them to state their case and convince the audience. If it's never been tried before, then that could also play to the opposition strengths because it's unprecedented. So the proposition then having the burden is then needs to convince the audience that something that no one's ever tried before, there's no real world evidence to point to that it would work, that it could work. So both of them could end up being helpful for the proposition, whether it's been tried before and has failed, or whether it's not been tried before. Alternatives. This is also known as the alternative scheme. So let's take that example of the BBC license fee. If the proposition were to suggest removing the license fee and so completely doing away with state financing for the BBC, the opposition could ask, are there alternatives that would achieve that same goal? That is, getting rid of the license fee. By looking at what other countries have done, notably Scandinavian countries, one would have discovered that they got rid of the license fee that was in place there, but they instead incorporated it in the form of a progressive tax linked to income. And thus, the state broadcaster still got its money, but the financing is done through a progressive tax rather than a flat fee. Now, of course, the proposition could then argue that that's worse, because the license fee being a separate fee, at least you can choose not to pay it technically. Whereas with a tax, there's no choice at all. There's no loopholes or get outs, or I don't own a television set, or it's not connected. I can't receive a live signal. I only watch old VHS tapes. You do need to be careful, though, that any alternative that you put forward is not one that could easily be combined with the proposition's proposal. And in formal debating, that's called a permutation, but no need to remember that just yet. Just remember this: if we can do both, it ain't an alternative. Logical. This is where you would need to listen out for logical errors in the proposition's argument. This is quite tricky, and it's something that comes with practice. But just for example, a basic one. If the proposition in that rationing debate had said that people who eat more meat have more health problems, you could point out that even if that is true, that is merely an instance of correlation and not causation. In other words, it may be the case, it may very well be the case that people who happen to eat a lot of meat also tend to be people who take less exercise, who smoke and drink too much, and generally have unhealthy lifestyles overall. And as such, they eat meat and they are unhealthy, a correlation, but they're not unhealthy because they eat meat, which would be causation. And so in forcing them to reduce their meat consumption, they would not magically be made healthier, would they? So this is correlation implies causation, or otherwise known as the false cause fallacy. And there are many logical fallacies, and too many to name here. In fact, it would require an entire session to go through them, as has been done in the past. But it's also something that the opposition should take care with to avoid these potential pitfalls, to avoid the infamous straw man and essentially end up not advancing the debate, talking at cross purposes. But it is a very powerful technique if you can spot these logical errors in the proposition's argument to then demolish them, hopefully. So petal, P-E-T-A-L. These examples and explanations that we've just looked at can actually be found in Chapter 4, Building an Opposition Argument, in William's new book, The Really Practical Guide to Debating, which I look forward to reading when it's available. Some other things to consider for the opposition. We want to begin with a clear stance, and this could be summed up in this sentence. Why is the proposition's world worse than ours? What core principle or idea are we defending? Because a strong stance guides all of your arguments and it helps to keep your case coherent. Identify the proposition's assumptions. Remember that all claims are based on an assumption to some extent. Is it overly optimistic, unrealistic? Are there false or tenuous causal links? Remember that correlation and causation. Is it perhaps a case of moral claims being presented as facts? Show that the proposition's world relies on unlikely, unrealistic, or unethical assumptions, wherever possible. Construct independent opposition arguments, and this could be a positive alternative. And why is this true or better? Try to provide evidence, examples, and analogies, and connect the argument directly back to the motion to show its impact. Essentially, demonstrate why opposition world, we all want to live in opposition world, not proposition world, because it's better. There are fewer harms, greater justice, better outcomes overall. So we've given you quite a lot to mull over for the time being. So I think at this stage, we'll have a break.
Perhaps.
Are we doing 10 minutes, William? So